arguments were presented today regarding imposing term limits upon members of Congress. Both of those arguments were compelling. Addison presented a comprehensive argument as to why term limits would be advantageous. According to Addison, imposing term limits would encourage active representation and allow opportunities for new ideas. Using Don Young as an example, Don Young is a representative from Alaska. He's served for over 46 years. Addison's point is that Don Young's extensive career in office can be viewed by some as a problem to the people he serves because no new ideas are being introduced and problems that new representatives may be able to identify, well, they just can't happen. Addison then continued that term limits would reduce the chances of corruption. This is extremely compelling, first of all, because I'm from Illinois, and second of all, because 16 members of Congress are currently under investigation for abuse of power or corruption. When looking at term limits through the lens of active representation, Occupy theory had this to say. The argument goes that term limits would motivate those who are eager to pursue an active agenda, rather than office seekers who are more interested in holding on to their position by avoiding troublesome votes or just keeping their heads down. In a political environment where bipartisan agreement is limited or just doesn't happen, the proposal for congressional limits, term limits, is a very popular one. Despite it being popular, we have to view it from the other side of the issue. And that the argument against term limits was made by Casey. As Casey presented earlier, some states have imposed term limits for their legislature. This is seen as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. In 1995, the Supreme Court decided in a 4-5 vote that states or Congress can't just make a law limiting the number of terms a Congress member can serve. Therefore, in order for term limits to be imposed on a constitutional level, an amendment would need to be made. Casey walked us through the process. According to the U.S. Senate, there have been over 11,000 proposals to amend the Constitution, but of those 11,000 proposals, only 27 have ever passed. Therefore, it's safe to say that the odds are not in favor of a constitutional amendment that imposes congressional term limits. Former South Carolina Representative Bob Inglis once said, "Asking an incumbent member of Congress to vote for term limits is much like asking a chicken to vote for Colonel Sanders." With only two possible ways of imposing term limits through a congressional amendment or an amendment to the Constitution, or imposing term limits on a state level, which is seen as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, the likelihood of imposing term limits is slim to none. No matter how advantageous or popular the idea is, the actual possibility of having Congress impose these limits is simply impossible at this point in our country's history. Therefore, I leave you with this quote by Robert Sherman. "Nothing renders government more unstable than a frequent change of the persons that administer it."